that. And what I thought was a timely thing to talk about this time of year is this insect called the emerald ash borer, but also, our trees have dropped their leaves. They may not be looking so good. We've had years of just really harsh weather for our plants, especially for our trees. And so, understanding like what some of those things are that might be causing more stress to them, hopefully will maybe be a little bit helpful for you guys. And I kind of always like to start it by, every call I get, whether it's for grass, for a shrub, for a tree, for anything, we blame bugs for anything that's going wrong with any plant system. And in reality, most of the time, it has nothing to do with the insect that you see, but it has maybe more something to do with a cultural issue that's going on. And the insects are a symptom or a sign of something greater that's happening. So it's like, you have a fever because there's an infection or there's some sort of an illness. And so taking Tylenol fixes the fever, but it doesn't maybe fix the infection. So worrying about the insects doesn't always get to the root of the issue that may be going on, especially with trees. So no matter what we talk, no matter what no matter what insect, I'm sorry, that I talk about, I am always trying to promote this idea of integrated pest management where we're carefully monitoring the plant system or your house or wherever it might be, but you're monitoring so that I have more than I had yesterday. That's whatever I'm doing, I'm seeing less, so it must be working. And then we put a lot of emphasis in cultural control, make the environment not suitable for your harmful insects, alter it in some way. Mechanical control is physically excluding or removing them or something like that. And then biological control is utilizing your good guys, recognizing who is good. And so if you do all of those things, those kind of building blocks, then we should put very little emphasis and very little effort into chemical control. So you'll hear a lot about that. And that's why I kind of try to focus on cultural control type issues. So when you have an established landscape plant like a tree, we tend to not really worry about them so much until they look bad. We ignore them, we appreciate them, but we really kind of ignore them. You cut back your landscape plants after it freezes in the springtime. You tend to your flowers and things like that. You definitely tend to your vegetable garden, but our trees often get overlooked and ignored. And usually that's fine. But when they start to show signs of stress, you really want to be a good detective and ask yourself some questions and do some searching. Is it getting watered enough? I mean, are we in a drought, and are they just really dry and really, really hot? And can you reduce that drought stress in some way? Are they experiencing some physical damage that might be making them smell good to some of these bad insects? Are you whacking it with the weed whacker? Our horticulture agent here in the Bexar County office calls that type of damage humanus stupidus. So are we doing something to physically cause damage to the tree that we shouldn't be doing? When you do wound a tree, it or any plant, it has an odor, a pheromone that it will give off, and it will attract some insects to it. So is that happening? Is the mulch in the right place that it should be? Is it crowded up where you're not seeing the flare roots? Some of those trees need those to be exposed. Is the soil now too compacted? Did you cut another tree down or trim up another tree that now gave this plant too much sun? Did that tree get too full where now it's not getting enough sun? Did you change something in the irrigation, or change something in the topography of your yard where now this plant's getting too much water when it didn't want as much? So look at all of those things and things that have changed. What is it that might be making this plant unhappy? And then also, don't forget that you have to be really careful with herbicides around trees, and you want to read that label really carefully. It may say oftentimes like don't apply within the drip line of the canopy. People will, I remember once we had someone here in the office, their parents had like a huge oak tree that was showing signs of herbicide damage, and the value of that tree is just immeasurable. And so it was just really sad to see that tree go into decline. But oftentimes we'll have people call in and they are exhibiting, they have these trees that are exhibiting signs of herbicide damage. And we'll ask, like, did you spray anything and it could have drifted? Did you, have you used herbicides? No, I would never do anything like that. But then you get to asking, well, did you fertilize recently? Yeah, I used a weed and feed. And you forget that the weeding part of the weed and feed is an herbicide. So be really careful with herbicides around your trees because they are pretty sensitive. I always like to throw this picture in here when we talk about tree health because in our minds, in this drought stricken world that we live in of Texas, it is almost unimaginable to think that a tree would not do well if it got water. I do not know what species of trees these are, but this is at our San Antonio Botanical Garden, and that they're the same species of tree. And the tree on the left is getting too much water. The tree on the right is happy and healthy, and it looks the way that it should. The one on the left was too close to a leaky faucet or something. And since I took this picture few years ago, they had to cut the tree down because it actually died. So some trees don't like a lot of water. Some need a lot of water and some don't want it at all. So think that too. A lot of times, overwatering damage can look just as bad as drought damage, and it can be really hard to know what the difference is unless you know what that plant wants. So before we get into what insects are harmful to the plants, the different ways that you would treat a tree for some sort of an insect are either going to be as a foliar spray, spraying the canopy, the leaf material, or a systemic. So a foliar spray is treating things that are chewing on the leaves. If the damaging insect is inside of the plant, this is not really going to be a very good method of controlling those guys because they're not outside there. Sometimes there are trunk sprays and it may kill them as they bore into the wood, but oftentimes we're using those foliar sprays to treat the leaf material that's being consumed. Systemics are either going to be a drench that you pour around the plant and the roots of the plant take it up, or it could be a trunk injection, or they could inject it directly into the soil. And so the idea is the roots take it, it goes through all the way through the tree up into the canopy and even into the leaf through the vascular tissue, and whatever encounters it inside of the tree is going to get sick and going to die from it. So when you're looking at options, think about how your insect is feeding so you can make that decision. Is it foliar or is it a systemic that I should use? And both of these options you can get as a homeowner. The thing with systemics you have to be careful with is if you have a flowering tree, not all trees, but some trees will take that into their pollen, and then you can affect your pollinators. So you might have to do a little research. So that's my little PSI statement about that. Also consider, so other things to consider, like bloom time. Things aren't blooming right now. Maybe you could use a systemic right now, and if that product is gone in 3 months, then maybe you're okay. Maybe you're not. So consider when that plant blooms, read the label really carefully. And I would always argue that if a plant is blooming, and I know there are exceptions to this rule, but if a plant is blooming, it's healthy. That's like the most costly, it's the most energy that it takes for that tree to do is to bloom, or a plant to do. So when they get stressed out, they're going to shut that down. And there are some I know that will bloom when they're stressed, but by and large, most plants that are blooming are happy, and you can ignore those insects that might be on it. So before we talk about emerald ash borer, let's talk about a couple of other boring insects first. So a boring insect are generally considered beetles. They will either lay their eggs on or close to, either on or like drill a hole into the trunk of the plant, trunk of the tree, and then the eggs hatch, and those little boring insects will bore into the tree. And sometimes they bore just underneath the bark, where they're in like the vascular system. Sometimes they're in the heart of the tree or in the dead part of the tree, or sometimes they're in dead wood. We have a couple different types. We have round-headed borers or longhorn borers. They have a rounder shaped head, both as the adult and as the larvae. And so their holes, their exit holes that you see there kind of on the right, are more round in shape, not oval, but definitely not like what you're going to see in a second. Most of these guys have very, very long antennae that are longer or as long as the length of the body. Not every one of them does. And they generally are going after stressed out plants, stressed trees, dead wood, firewood, things that are damaged, a dropped limb, things like that. Flat-headed borers are a beetle that is kind of like bullet shaped or boat shaped. The larvae have like this alien like smushed head, and then the adult head is also very compressed and like oval shaped. So their exit holes are almost rectangular in size, but they're much more oval, much more smushed than the round-headed borers. And these really, most of these species are truly secondary invaders. They like super sick wood or super dead wood, like you find them in firewood, dead wood. So most of these guys are going to be secondary invaders, a sign of something going on, but not the cause of it going on. So, and I think understanding its life cycle helps you understand what you see doesn't mean something's happening necessarily right now. So some sort of damage will occur, or stress, humanus stupidus, we hit it with the weed whacker, a wound, lightning strikes, we have really dry summer, really hot summer, something like that. So there's some stress that this tree is going to take on. The beetle is attracted to it because it's releasing these smells that say, come take advantage of this situation. Those eggs will hatch, and the larvae and pupal stage. So the larvae will burrow in around inside of that plant, feeding on the plant material. Then it will become a pupa. And this larva and pupa stage can last 12 months and sometimes even longer, depending on the species. When they're finished being a pupa, the adult will leave the tree. And that's when you see the holes inside of the branches and the trunk. So what you see, the evidence that you see, is the end of this life cycle. And most of these guys are not going to reinfest unless this tree is just really bad off. And so you kind of have to rewind what was going on 12 to 24 months ago that could have been stressful to the tree. And this summer wasn't so bad, but we, in 2023 and 2022, we had the hottest summers and we had the driest summers, and we had a lot of sunburn on our plants and just a lot of stress on our trees. Then I think we had that ice freeze in 2024, early 2024. So we have this kind of awful weather pattern for plants. It's hard for us. So imagine what it's like for a plant that's outside all of the time and they can't really adapt or get comfortable. So when you see damage in your tree, it's the end of the life cycle. It's evidence that that tree needed a little bit of help. And my suggestion is baby the tree, take care of the tree going forward, fertilize it properly, water it well, prune it the way it should be pruned. And you shouldn't see this reoccurring. So these are secondary pests. You see holes in your plant. I would not worry about the insects at all. I would just wonder, can I do something to make my tree a little bit happy? Managing the stress is really the way to control these. And prevention is always better than anything, which is to manage the stress, right? You could maybe try to do a liquid application on the bark when the adults are present, but the problem is the timeline. I don't know if I have a picture of we only know the timeline of some of them. Some of them lay their eggs all the time. But even when you look at this, like red-headed borer, what is spring for us? And sometimes it starts in February. Sometimes we never get a winter, and it's like spring, fall through March. What exactly is summer and fall? Like our time and our weather is not consistent enough for us to pinpoint a time when you should apply like a foliar application to the trunk. So instead, bottom line, don't worry about boring insects unless it's this emerald ash borer. So emerald ash borer is a really bummer of an insect. If you can recall how awful it still is, but how panicked most of us were when we found out about oak wilt, and that all of our oak trees are going to die and our canopies are all going to look different. Our landscape is going to look so different, right? And this is kind of that same doomsday type of a feeling. So these boring insects, emerald ash borer, is a very invasive beetle. I think it's in more states than this map shows. This was just from 2018, but if I'm not mistaken, it's in Washington. So it's made its way all the way to the East Coast. I'm sorry, far West Coast as well. And it was introduced around the Detroit area in about the 90s, we think, because once they become established and they're found, they've probably been there 2 to 5 years. So that the estimation, I don't remember what the date was when they actually found it, but going backwards, they estimate that it probably made it here in the 90s, and probably on pallets of ash that was used for shipping containers. And right now it's in about 35 states, including making its way right through Texas. And if you look at it, it's a really pretty beetle, as are most things that are bad. It is this really emerald, gorgeous color. If you were to lift the wings and look underneath, it has like a coppery, and in some pictures I've seen a pink color. I've never seen one in the wild alive. I've only seen, specimens of it. So I can't tell you if they all look like that, but I do know dead, they're very pretty. And in pictures, they're pretty. And they're not very big. At the very largest, they're going to be only about 1/2 inch in length. And very skinny. They're like a skinny, skinny little bullet shaped thing. We used to think that they only went after ash species, and they will attack all species of ash trees, whether those are native or you planted them. But we also have found that they, and this is kind of newish information, that they will also attack fringe trees. And fringe tree is apparently a native tree that a lot of us have. I don't know that I'm not a tree person, so I don't know how common it is. But we have fringe trees throughout most of Texas, I believe. And like the bottom picture, it shows it kind of as real thin branches and a thin trunk. Emerald ash borer really doesn't care how wide the diameter of the branch or the trunk is. It's also known to go after European olive. And so that could be a big problem in areas of the United States where olive is a major industry. So this is a map that the USDA put out that shows the distribution of native ash in Texas. And so you can see, it's mainly in the eastern, to the east, I guess, of 35 almost. But we also have, and I guess there's a couple species down here south and kind of in the little armpit right there, right? But we have a lot of planted ash trees, and especially in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, every developer in the state of Texas planted Arizona ash because it was cheap and it grew fast and it was green. And those are dying on their own. They only live about 30 to 40 years and they've hit their 30 to 40-year mark. But there are some ash trees that people have planted. And so this is a concern, not because of our forests that have ash in them, but also because of trees that you plant in your landscape. You spent money on them, you spent time taking care of them, and you don't want those things to die off. So the life cycle of this emerald ash borer is that in the summertime for us, May to August, they will come out of the tree and start to mate. And they'll feed on foliage of fringe ash and European olive. And they lay anywhere from 40 to 200 eggs. So a ton of different eggs in crevices of the bark. And then those eggs will hatch. And this weird tapewormy looking flat-headed borer will start to girdle the tree and go through the vascular tissue. They're kind of this milky white. They're a really serrated look to them. And they hatch within 7 to 10 days. I should go back and point out, though, that the emergence hole that the adults make is D-shaped, and that's really characteristic of emerald ash borer. That's, if you suspect you have them, we always say take a picture of the exit hole, because if it doesn't look like that and it's not a native, it's not one of their host plants, then it's not it, right? But that makes that D-shaped hole. The larvae are the damaging form, and what they're doing is they're underneath the bark surface and they're feeding on that vascular tissue and they're girdling the tree. And so they're just going around and they essentially cut off the circulation. They like squeeze the stomach shut of the tree. And so now nutrients can't make its way through all to the top of the tree. And so nutrients get stopped because that vascular tissue was choked down. They will also make these kind of serpentine galleries underneath the bark. And so when the plant gets pretty bad, the bark might come off easier and you start to see these shaped kind of a SE type galleries that would be indicative of these guys. Just to kind of remind you, if you're not familiar with the vascular tissue or how trees work, kind of in my mind, I think the roots take it up and it goes through the center of the plant. And in reality, the vascular tissue for the plant is actually on the outside of the, kind of like right underneath the bark. And so that's where these emerald ash borers are burrowing. And that's why they're so damaging and detrimental to the tree. They are attracted to sick trees, healthy trees, probably healthy trees more so than even sick trees, because they will get more nutrition from them. And this makes them very different from all the other borers, which are opportunistic. These guys are not. They will kill an ash tree once they get into it. If they're not, there's a certain time frame when you can successfully get rid of them and that the tree can bounce back. But and I'll show you kind of some pictures and we'll talk about that, but if left to their own devices, they will kill a tree. And so, kind of the big doomsday thing about them is if we don't do anything about them, we will no longer have any ash anywhere in Texas or the United States, wherever these guys take off. So there was a question in the chat if ash juniper is affected by emerald ash borer. I don't know the answer to that because I'm not familiar with trees, but if it is a Fraxinus species or gene in the genus of ash, then yes. If it's not, then no. Okay, so the signs and symptoms of emerald ash borer, if you have an ash, especially for ash trees, I believe that fringe trees are probably pretty similar, but more specifically for your ash, signs and symptoms would be that the top third of the canopy is going to die back because theoretically the borers are boring kind of right here and girdling it right here. So the top is no longer getting nutrition, only everything underneath is. You'll also get these epicormic shoots because nutrition is cut off. And so they're trying to just shoot out whatever they can to photosynthesize. And once you have epicormic shoots produced, that generally means that the tree won't recover. And it's best to chop it down and not let that, keep going. The D-shaped holes are a big characteristic. Host D-shaped holes, and you're kind of seeing that dieback, but you also might see these serpentine galleries. Remember, the exit holes are just when the adults are leaving. And so if no adults have left yet, then you may not see those. You may also have some increased woodpecker damage or activity, but I wouldn't go off of that as a sole reason to assume that you have boring insects. They're kind of like hogs, right? They're going to dig wherever to try to see if they can find something. It may not necessarily mean there's anything underneath that wood. So in emerald ash borer was in Arkansas, and it was further north from that for quite a while. So the Texas Forest Service was well aware that this was going to probably make its way to Texas at some point. And in 2012, they started putting out traps. In 2016, they caught their first emerald ash borer in Harrison County, Karnak, I believe, Texas. So kind of on the Arkansas-Texas border, right? Far northeastern part of the state. And then since then, we had this kind of just adjacent counties. It just kind of spread probably pretty naturally. But I don't remember what year it was, but and maybe in 2019 or so, it jumped to Tarrant County and Dallas County. And the real big question was, how did it make that big jump if we're not catching it in these other adjacent states? Well, humans were moving them. So we believe that movement is going to occur with we move firewood, but also with infested nursery stock and other wood that's infested with it. So there's a quarantine in these counties where it is currently found where you can't transport those wood materials unless they've been treated in some way. So don't buy firewood off the side of the road in these locations. In 2024, this year, it's kind of moved down the I-35 corridor. And so, I don't know where everybody is, but I'm sitting here in Bexar County, not as close. But when you found them, they have been there for a minimum of 2 years, and they can travel up to 2 miles to find another host tree, but the majority of them will lay their eggs within, 100-yard radius, right? Or half a mile or less, but they'll go further should they have to. So they can spread pretty quickly, plus what we move around. So it's very, very likely that a lot of these counties around here that touch are also infested. And so it's only a matter of time probably before it makes its way into the rest of Texas, especially if there are those host trees present. So if you think that you have them, and right now is not the time to think that you have them unless you see exit holes, but what you're going to probably start noticing is damage and or evidence of them around May, once things are really nice and warm for us in Texas. We're at the start of summer. So I would take a picture of the symptoms, find exit holes if you can. If you can catch a specimen, collect it and take good care of it. You can store it in a baggie in the freezer. You can put it in rubbing alcohol, at least 70%. There are a lot of lookalikes, very, very closely related species, even in the same genus. that look a lot like emerald ash borer that we already find here. And I get phone calls all the time. I have found this, so I found so and so. I know I have. But the EPA or USDA or whoever it is that, quarantines things and or says, yes, it's been found here. A&M doesn't, right? We don't believe anyone that says they found something unless we actually have a voucher specimen to identify and prove that's what it is. So try to collect it if you think you found one, and take some pictures. This is the hotline to report it. I will say though, I don't know if that number really works that well. So if you can't get through to it, I would try to contact someone, a local forester with your Texas Forest Service, and or just reach out to your local extension office and see if they can get you in touch with the Forest Service or help you out further. But if you were to send it to me, I'd reach out to the Forest Service and ask them, where do we go from here? Especially if that hotline is busy. Because it was this summer when they were popping up in other counties, you couldn't get through. Here's some of those lookalikes. If our emerald ash borer is in the middle and side by side, you're like, well, sure, the color's different. These are more olive. But in real life, when you're looking at them, they look pretty darn similar. So, I say this just to kind of drive home the point that you actually want to collect it if you think that you found one. Oh, I'm sorry. I might have missed some questions in the chat. I'm just checking that real fast. I think we're okay. So this is the quarantine right now. You can't move firewood, all hardwood, nursery stock, or any other living, dead, cut, fallen, including green lumber, logs, stumps, roots, branches, in the genus Fraxinus. So any ash, anything is not supposed to be moved out of those yellow quarantined areas because emerald ash borer could be infesting it. So if you get emerald ash borer, if the tree is heavily infested, then they should be destroyed because all there are is like an emerald ash borer bomb, and they're just breeding more of those things. If the tree has less than 30% dieback, it can be treated and salvaged and saved. But if it's more than 30%, it's not recoverable. And one of the reasons is the vascular tissue is so damaged that, remember how the systemics take the pesticide in through the roots and carry it through the tree, it won't make its way up to the top of the tree, so that you can't get sufficient pesticide application to properly manage them. And it's recommended that to destroy them, you can mulch them, cut them down, burn it, I guess, but just don't move that wood outside of your quarantined area. So if they have less than 30% canopy dieback, I think it's well worth trying to, try to salvage that tree. Maybe your tree is this large and it's a major part of your landscape. Maybe if it's just a little baby one, you want it to grow one day. But they can be managed. And up in the Dallas area, there are some arborists I know that are doing like a more professional grade treatment for homeowners and parks and other areas. And they're finding that they don't have to go back and retreat for like 2 to 5 years. And so if you kind of get on that regimen, then you can salvage these trees, which are an immense value to your property and to the way things look. And I really wish I had a picture of it, but I've sat through a presentation before where it was a neighborhood and they had a sidewalk and a median, so if you can imagine that this kind of spreads on through those parking spaces. And in that green area between the sidewalk and the road, the county or city municipality had planted ash trees. So there's a before picture showing this gorgeous neighborhood with these tall, beautiful trees. And you look at it and you think, this is like an upper middle class. This is a really nice looking neighborhood. Well, the city decided when emerald ash borer started to infest, instead of treating these trees, it was more cost effective for them to just cut them down. And so the after picture is all of these trees gone. And it doesn't even look like the same neighborhood. These same exact houses don't look as pretty. They don't look as valuable. So the value of a tree is, arguably in your landscape is, it's huge, right? Currently, systemics are the only available option that is the most successful to control them for homeowners. There are some foliar applications that a professional could do, but you can get your hands on products pretty easily. So we have come up with an emerald ash borer guide for professionals. So if you have a private applicator license, you could get your hands on some of these things. These are systemics, and the systemics will target both the adults and the larvae. If you're concerned about pollinators, So they'll eat when the adults eat the leaves, they'll get the pesticide, but they're controlling the larvae in the tree. If you're concerned about pollinators, ash will produce pollen. It's wind pollinated. It's not insect pollinated. So they're not really doing a whole lot to draw the pollinators to them. Doesn't mean they won't use it. But a study was done that found that the systemic doesn't make its way into the pollen. So you can use a soil drench and kind of be rest assured that your pollinators are going to be fine. It's a drench, or you can also apply granules that you water in, and then the roots take it up into the plant. And there's a whole table for professionals. You know, if you have a lawn or a tree guy and you find that you're in this situation and they don't really know what to do, we have resources for them. But there's also things that you can do. Like if you have small ash trees that aren't these huge, gigantic things where you feel like you need to call a professional, you can get your hands on plenty of products that they sell at Lowe's and Home Depot, or online, of course. And these are going to be soil drenches or granules that you will apply. And you can see a lot of them have names that, you know, you've probably seen before. We don't have we have a fact sheet, but we don't have like a guide for homeowners. So I would go to emeraldashborer.info, or I just Google insecticide options for emerald ash borer, and it's usually the first thing that pops up. And inside of this book, it is filled with good information from a lot of different universities, extension locations, and multiple experts in this. But they tell you like when to put things out, right? Early to mid spring, and what you can use, and this one not until it's leafed out. So there is good information for you so that you can successfully prevent emerald ash borer from hurting your trees. Now, a couple of things I would just say: read the label carefully. If the soil's frozen or oversaturated, obviously don't apply it. We don't have frozen soil very much in Texas, so that's not something you have to worry too much about. And if you have mulch around the trees, pull it back at least a foot and then put it back the way it was. But you want to move it so that you get that deep into the soil instead of letting the mulch absorb it. So, we don't have emerald ash borer all throughout Texas, but let's say that you want to prevent them from hurting a tree. You think you're fairly close. The recommendation is if you any ash tree, any host tree within 30 miles of an emerald ash borer infestation should be treated as a preventive. So, there's not a map in like McLennan County that shows where it's been infested. But I would say if you live in that county, you should probably, if you want to salvage these trees, you want to save them, you should probably treat them as a preventive before the infestation comes in. If you are within 30 miles of any of those counties, then it's probably a good idea for you to do that as well, if these are trees that you want to save. If you don't care, it doesn't matter, right? Somebody did a cost savings analysis and did find that preventive treatments before infestation is much, much cheaper than removing the trees later. Now, if it's a little tiny tree that just takes your loppers to chop down, then that's nothing, right? That's just a couple minutes of your time. But this is more for like those large trees with a large diameter, where to treat the tree, about $300, and it'll get you 3 years of treatment, versus removing them could be, 3,000 or more, depending on the situation. So, more cost effective to preventively treat if you're within 30 miles of one of those infestations. I'm going to skip through that. So, going forth, we're kind of going to be living with these things. It will make its way probably throughout most of the state. It's just a matter of time before it does it. And it seems like they trap every single year. Texas Forest Service traps and puts out traps every single summer or end of spring. But it seems like it's like every 4 years when we'll have a whole bunch of them show up. And I don't know why it is that way, but it may be quiet for a few more years until it pops up further down 35 or spreads further east or west. Who knows? So moving forward, to slow this spread down, try not, don't move infested firewood from infested counties, or don't move firewood from infested counties, and follow those quarantine rules. And if those trees are unhealthy, replace them. If they are infested past the 30% dieback, then go ahead and pull it up and replace it with a new species. And if you're a landscaper or landscape architect or whatever, and you plant things, don't use a monoculture, give a good variety of things so that when something comes in that's as damaging as this is, you're not stuck with nothing, and have to wait in
Not
30
asking
years.
you that you wouldn't want them.
Oh, hold on a second.
And then, um,
There we go. Sorry. Um, I lost my train of thought, but avoid monocultures, right? Because when something bad comes in, you don't have an option. You got to wait for those trees to come back. So, and then when you're in 30 if you're within 30 miles, treat those healthy trees to keep them healthy. I do have a couple other things to show you that I can go through really quick. Let me pull up the chat and see if there is any question.
soon if you want it, but if you want it warm,
Okay. Is there much known about the effects of systemic treatment on birds that eat the seeds? Bird biology, boar biology is pretty different. I'm not sure. I really don't know, Carol, if systemics get into the seeds. It's more the biology of the tree though, and like as far as like, if it gets into the seed, um because we're looking at like when you apply the systemic, when is the bloom going to be? But the big worry with systemics is that it's negatively impactful on pollinators because it's an insecticide. A bird or lizard, or well, not lizard, but a bird or a squirrel or anything would have to consume a lot of seed from that tree for it to get a lethal dose. So I don't know the answer to that, but that's a really interesting question. But I think they'd have to eat a whole lot for that to be a problem. Somebody asked about where can I find that one guide? It was Emerald Ash Borer info.com. Sorry, let me go down. emeraldashborerinfo.com. Or I'm sorry, emeraldashborer.info. And then there's a question, bought wood logs at HEB and the bore holes in a few logs, pulled them out of my fireplace, not affecting I wouldn't worry about it at all. They go after dead wood, and that was dead wood. So when you get borers in your firewood, don't worry about taking it into your house or having them move into a tree. Worry if your tree's sick, worry about that. But they're not, boring insects will not go into healthy trees. I do not know what the effect of systemics is on fungi. Probably minimal though. The professional guide you can find, so this one, the professional guide for emerald ash borers is at the AgriLife bookstore, and that is agrilifelearn.tamu.edu. I just put it in the chat, except when I hit enter, it made that little dash. Don't use that. Let me just show you a couple of fun things that I always get questions about. So sometimes in the fall, we will get phone calls. I will get phone calls and people say, I walked outside and it's like your tree just got a trim. They just cut a little bit off of your tree. Well, we have these things called tree girdlers, and this longhorn beetle will lay its egg on the terminal end of a little branch, and then it will girdle, the adult will girdle, chew, 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 chew. And so it makes it really, it's about to crack, right? It's about to break. And on a windy night, when the wind starts blowing through, all these branches will pop off and they'll fall down to the ground. And it's like someone played a practical joke on you. And it's not hurting the tree in any way, shape, or form. If you don't like the way it looks, if you don't like this happening, the best thing you can do is pick up the fallen ends and destroy those instead of leaving them on the ground, because the next generation is in those fallen ends. But it's just a weird thing that happens. Fall webworms are always kind of a concern for people. They like any tree. Any tree is susceptible, but they do tend to really love to go after pecan trees. Excuse me. They won't kill a tree unless that tree's already in big trouble and they're just kind of putting it out of its misery. They will leaf back out. In fact, I have pictures of the webbing and then new leaves that are forming inside of that webbing after those guys took off. So they build a web, feed on the leaf material in the web, and then once it's gone, then they go and build another web. And so you see these webs all over the tree. Best thing you could really do is open the web and let birds and lizards and other things feed on those caterpillars. And even if you are going to be treating, you have to break open the webs because no foliar insecticide is going to penetrate through that. So why don't you just try? If you can break it open, try it and see what happens. Let nature do its thing. And if that's not working, then maybe apply a foliar application. As our mountain laurels are going to start leafing out again, hopefully sometime soon, you might notice some leaf feeding damage by this Genista caterpillar. They have figured out a way to feed on the toxic mountain laurels and not get sick themselves. And they're around all year long, but they really, nice, juicy, tender new growth is going to be a lot yummier to them. If this mountain laurel is already happy and healthy, I suggest just forgetting about it. Just let them have a little bit of it. If it's a young transplant and you want it to grow, or it's not doing good otherwise, or something like that, then you might want to apply any kind of foliar application that's meant for caterpillars. And also in the spring, we will tend to get cankerworm infest or little outbreaks of them. They're like an inchworm that dangle from these strands, and they either come in a brown or a green form. Don't really defoliate the tree in any way, but they can like stain your sidewalks and patio furniture and things like that. And so in that way, they might be a nuisance, but that's when there's tons of them. If you can tolerate them, they will have this little explosion and they'll die off on their own. So that's, I tend to let nature do what nature's going to do. And that would be my suggestion, unless they're really bugging you. But sometimes we have some caterpillars that are stinging caterpillars. They hurt really bad and you don't want to mess with them and get into them. And so these may not be causing damage to your tree, but they can cause damage to you, or they drop out of the tree that, overhangs a sidewalk or something like that. I was speaking recently at something, and a man came up afterwards and he said that his experience, and I'm curious if I'm going to start kind of paying attention to this. So these pus caterpillars have these venom barbs under their body, and terrible, terrible reaction you can have to them, incredibly painful. Never been stung myself, but I understand it to be one of the most painful things. These guys, if you can just rope off the area, avoid going into the area, because if you find one on like a holly bush, there's more, but they don't really, it's like they stay put on one plant. So if you find them in an area, rope it off and keep people from going in there. And they'll have this little kind of bloom and then they'll die off on their own. Something kills them. He was explaining what it was. I don't remember if it was a bacteria or something in nature that goes after them. So if you can do that, maybe try that. But if you can't, like one time they were getting into buses that had the windows down and kids were getting stung and going to the hospital. Well, in that case, they needed to be treated, right? And so use something that's meant for caterpillars. I'll show you a slide in a second. There's some more pus caterpillars that look more yellow. There's others that have if it has hairs, don't touch it. It's probably going to hurt you. These guys really travel. This is the eastern buck moth. And so they're not just stuck in one place. They're all over the place, and they may need to be controlled to avoid people getting hurt. So here's some options. BT is a good organic option that only affects caterpillars. Spinosad is another organic option that will affect other things, but it's fairly benign on your beneficials. And then things that have a little bit longer residual, except for spinosad, are the synthetic pyrethroid type things. But in most cases with caterpillars, it's a quick outbreak and then it goes away on its own. I also want to mention crepe myrtle bark scale really quickly. This is an aesthetic issue, but we're learning also that they can, we've got some trees that might not do well if we don't treat for them. Really, we're trying to figure this out because you physically, you can't really clean this off. It's a scale that covers the bark and it causes sooty mold. And we grow crepe myrtles or we plant them because of their aesthetic value, and they affect the aesthetics, right? So the current recommendation, the only thing that has been shown to work, is to utilize a systemic at bud break in March. But we also know that honeybees love crepe myrtles. Honeybees more so than other pollinators. There was a study that was done in which urban beekeepers took pollen and it was analyzed, and the primary pollen was from crepe myrtles. Honeybees love them. Well, when you use a systemic, it affects your pollinators' health also. And so that's not a great recommendation anymore. So we're trying to do some studies right now to pull the pollen off of crepe myrtles that are treated with a systemic to determine if the systemic gets into the pollen at lethal doses that can cause harm. And if it doesn't, then, oh, what a relief. We can still recommend this. But if it does, we're going to have to come up with some better management plans that, aren't going to be so harmful for our pollinators. So if you, and I would say, we stress these crepe myrtles out, and the more stressed they are, the more they're going to get this crepe myrtle bark scale. If you have crepe myrtles, you probably already have the bark scale. It's pretty prevalent. We plant them in these medians where they, even tighter than this, where they don't have enough, soil for their roots. We do crepe murder, right? And we prune them when we shouldn't prune them, and excessive pruning will be attractive to those guys. If you want it to be small, plant a dwarf, plant a miniature. If you don't plant the big ones, right? There's no need to prune them like that. And so if you have crepe myrtles that we think we found a crepe myrtle farm that we can do this with, but I'm still kind of trying to keep in my pocket some location. So if you have a crepe myrtle tree or a lot of them or an area, and they're already going to be treated with a systemic, let me know so I can go, if I can get, if they're not too tall where I can't get to it, so I can collect the pollen when they bloom. And it has to be a plant that's healthy enough that it will bloom, because you got to get a lot of pollen to be able to analyze it. So looking for some sites like that potentially for this spring to figure out if that's going to be a problem or not. I'm going to keep skipping through here till I get to the end. Sorry. Oops. I was trying to get to my last slide so that you guys, and I don't have it in there. Well, it's missing. Hopefully y'all already know my email address, and so you don't need it. And you're on the mail deal, so you'll get the emails when another class is coming out. But if y'all have any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat, or you can also email me.